Luigi Orione was born on June 23, 1872, in Pontecuron, a small village nestled between Piedmont and Lombardy. It was a simple place, where life moved at a humble pace, yet everything was deeply shaped by faith. From very early on, that environment began shaping his story, giving him the foundations of the person he would eventually become. His father, Vittorio, worked paving roads, a hard, demanding trade marked by long days of heavy labor. His mother, Carolina, was the opposite in spirit and tenderness. Deeply religious, she passed on to her son a sense of compassion so strong that it later became one of the clearest marks of his life. She was the one who taught young Luis to look at the poor with gentleness and to recognize God in those who suffer. Growing up surrounded by poverty didn't make him hardened. It actually did the opposite. It opened his eyes. From a very young age, Luis showed a sincere desire to serve and help others. He noticed the needs around him with an unusual sensitivity for a child. To help at home, Luis worked as an apprentice paver from age 10 to 13, following his father under the hot sun and clouds of dust. But while he laid stones on the ground, something else was being built inside him, the dream of becoming a priest. Even when he came home exhausted, his heart burned with that desire. There's a curious episode often remembered when people talk about his childhood. Urbano Ratazzi, a well-known politician, once picked little Luis up in his arms and said, "We'll make him a general." He had no idea that those words, said jokingly, would turn out to be prophetic, because Luigi Orione did become a general, but a general of charity. At 13, Luis took an important step toward the dream he'd carried since childhood. He entered the Franciscan convent of Vagara. He was young, fragile, and full of hope, but an unexpected illness forced him to leave just a few months later. At first, it looked like a setback, almost like a door closing. But how many times in life do situations that feel like defeats end up being necessary detours towards something greater? In 1886, another path opened, this time for good. Luis was welcomed into the Salesian Oratory of Valdocco in Turin, where he spent 3 years under the direct guidance of St. John Bosco. There, he found not just a teacher, but a model. Don Bosco treated him as one of his favorite students, recognizing in that young man the spark of a future great servant of the church. At the oratory, Luis received a solid formation: discipline, joy, spirituality, and dedication to poor youth, the pillars of Salesian life. It was there that he discovered his vocation wasn't just to become a priest, but to be an educator, a welcoming presence, and a source of hope for those who needed it most. When Don Bosco died in 1888, Luis went through a moment of deep pain, but also transformation. He was present at the saint's final moments, and, according to accounts, it was during that period that his own fragile health was restored in what many considered a miraculous way. For him, this wasn't coincidence. It was a sign that God still had great plans for his life. On October 16, 1889, Luis took another decisive step. He entered the seminary of Tortona. There, he strengthened his priestly vocation and began actively engaging in charitable work, visiting the sick, helping the poor, and organizing small initiatives for those in need. It was as if his Salesian formation was now blossoming even more deeply. Before even becoming a priest, Luigi Orione showed a rare spiritual maturity. At the Tortona Seminary, he didn't limit himself to academic life. He took part in the St. Martian Mutual Aid Society and in the St. Vincent Delaware Paul Conferences, groups dedicated to helping the poor, the sick, and the abandoned. Through those visits, he learned to look sufferers in the eye and recognize, in them, Christ himself. That experience awakened in him an increasing desire to do more. So, while still a seminarian, on July 3, 1892, he founded his first oratory. It wasn't just a physical space. It became a place of welcome, recreation, and Christian formation for poor boys. For many of them, that place became a refuge, a source of hope, and the beginning of a new life. The next step came quickly. On October 15, 1893, he decided to open a boarding school for young boys in need, an ambitious project for someone so young and without resources. But Luis had something few people have, an unshakable trust in Divine Providence. He believed that if the work truly belonged to God, then God himself would open the necessary doors. and the event that marked the founding of that boarding school became almost symbolic of Father Orione's entire life. The property owner required 400 lire up front for the rent, a sum Luis didn't have. In the middle of that uncertainty, an elderly woman approached him on the street and asked how much it would cost to enroll her grandson in the new school. When he told her the amount, she handed him exactly 400 lire, money she had saved for years. For Luis, this wasn't coincidence, it was pure providence. With that unexpected gesture, the boarding school became a reality. And without knowing it, that elderly woman helped ignite a flame that would shine across the world for decades to come. April 13th, 1895 marked one of the most decisive moments in the life of Luis Orione, his priestly ordination in Tortona. After years of formation, humble service, and constant contact with the poor, he finally became a priest, ready to pour every moment of his life into caring for souls. Right after the ceremony, he made a gesture that revealed how far ahead he was thinking. He handed his clerical cassock to 6 young students from his school who showed signs of priestly vocation. That moment symbolized something much bigger. Luis never intended to walk alone. From the very beginning, he knew his mission would grow through other lives equally eager to serve. With a heart full of zeal, he began expanding his work. In a short time, he opened new houses and schools, first in Mornico Lasana, then in Noto, in Sicily, and soon after in San Remo and Rome. Each new place was a concrete response to the needs of the time. Young people without opportunities, poor families, orphans with no one to support them. This rapid expansion caught the attention of many priests and seminarians who began drawing closer to Father Orione, attracted by his energy, simplicity, and love for the poorest. Little by little, a strong and united group began forming around him, held together by the same ideal, serving God through charity. From that spontaneous unity came the seed of a new religious work. Without big administrative plans, but with incredible spiritual passion, Father Orione was beginning to give shape to what would eventually become an entire family within the church. By the end of the 19th century, after years of hands-on experience caring for the poor, Luis Orione realized that his mission had outgrown small, isolated initiatives. It was time to give structure and continuity to that growing movement of young men and priests walking at his side. So, in 1899, the foundation of what would become the Congregation of the Sons of Divine Providence was officially born, a group made up of priests, brothers, and even hermits, all united by the same ideal of charity. This bold step soon earned the Church's recognition. On March 21, 1903, the little work of Divine Providence received canonical approval, solidifying itself as a new spiritual force in Italy. To Father Orione, this wasn't just official paperwork. It was confirmation that Providence truly guided every step of his mission. At the heart of this work was a charism both profoundly simple and profoundly revolutionary: to lead the small, the poor, and the people to the Church and to the Pope through works of charity. This phrase captures the spirit of Father Orione, someone who saw charity not just as a social gesture, but as a direct bridge to God. He believed that nothing brings people closer to Christ more than the concrete experience of love. Another striking aspect of his congregation was the desire of its members to profess, in addition to the traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a fourth vow, a special pledge of fidelity to the Pope. This commitment made it clear how deeply Father Orione cared about the unity of the Church, and how convinced he was that charity reaches its full power only when it's rooted in communion with Rome. And now I'd like to ask you, if you could make a special commitment to your faith today, what would it be? In the end, 3 ideas summed up Orione's entire theological vision: renew everything in Christ, renew everything in the Church, and renew everything through charity. As Father Orione's mission took shape, new needs arose, and with them, new paths for service. In 1899, one of the most unique branches of his work came to life: the Hermits of Divine Providence. These men dedicated their lives to silent prayer and sacrifice, spiritually supporting all the congregation's external works. It was as if, behind every active gesture of charity, there was a quiet heart beating on behalf of everyone. In 1915, at the height of his spiritual maturity, Father Orione took another decisive step. he founded the Little Missionary Sisters of Charity. These sisters dedicated their entire lives to the poor, the sick, and the abandoned, living charity in a concrete, deeply maternal way. They weren't just helpers, they were loving presence, companionship, and comfort. As time went on, the family grew even more. Two communities known for their profound spirituality joined the work: the blind Sacramentine adorers, dedicated to Eucharistic adoration and to offering their own limitations as prayer, and the contemplatives of Jesus crucified, who lived in silence and continuous prayer. These groups showed that, in Father Orione's vision, charity wasn't only action, it was also contemplation. Beyond the religious communities, Father Orione knew that many laypeople longed to be part of his mission. So he organized several groups for men and women who wanted to live the charism in everyday life. That's how the Ladies of Divine Providence, the Alumni Association, the Friends, and later the Orionine Secular Institute, ISO, were formed. To unite all these branches, the Orionine Lay Movement, MLO, was also created. It really makes you think, how many people, even without a religious vocation, can carry charity into spaces where priests and sisters may never be able to reach? This expansion showed something deep about Father Orione. He didn't want to build just a congregation. He wanted to build a spiritual family, one big enough to embrace every kind of vocation, from contemplatives to missionaries, from religious to lay people. After World War I, the world was full of wounds, and human needs seemed to multiply by the day. In that landscape, Father Orione's work grew in ways no one expected. Schools, training centers, agricultural colonies, workshops, orphanages, and shelters began appearing as direct answers to the pain of the time. It was as if each new institution silently whispered to the suffering, "You're not alone." These initiatives weren't born out of cold planning or strategy. They grew out of Father Orione's encounter with the concrete reality of the poor. He would see a need and, almost instinctively, create a solution. A workshop to teach a trade, an orphanage to receive children with nowhere to go, a school to open doors. Among all these works, one became the symbol of his charism, the Little Catalangos. Always located on the outskirts of major cities, they were places dedicated to society's most forgotten. People with disabilities, the abandoned, the chronically ill, and all those the world considered without a place. Father Orione often said these centers should be beacons of faith and civilization and new pulpits of evangelization. In these places, charity wasn't theory, it was daily life. The Little Catalangos became refuge to thousands, and at the same time, a living testimony to the world. They showed that human dignity never disappears, even when society looks away. Beyond institutions, Father Orione also moved the people through popular initiatives. He organized live nativity scenes that brought entire communities together, parish missions that renewed whole towns, pilgrimages that reignited faith, and social works that restored hope to those who had already lost it. Long before his work gained international recognition, Father Orione was already known as someone who simply could not remain indifferent to human suffering. His response to disasters marked his history and made him a respected figure throughout Italy. In every crisis, his actions were quick, courageous, and driven by a love that didn't know limits. The first major tragedy that put Father Orione at the center of national attention was the 1908 earthquake in Messina and Reggio Calabria, one of the worst natural disasters in Italian history. While many fled, he ran straight into the heart of the destruction. He stayed there for years, taking in orphans, comforting the wounded, feeding survivors, and helping rebuild entire communities. His dedication was so extraordinary that Pope Pius X named him Vicar General of the Diocese of Messina, recognizing his leadership and his ability to restore hope where only ruins remained. A few years later, in 1915, another catastrophe struck Italy, the Marsica earthquake. Once again, Father Orione didn't hesitate. He headed straight to the devastated region and, with the same determination, devoted himself to rescuing and sheltering the victims, especially the young and the orphaned. His presence wasn't only material, it was spiritual. He gave faith back to those who had lost everything. These relief missions revealed something remarkable about his personality, his ability to act with organization and courage even in completely chaotic situations. That's why many people began calling him the strategist of charity. Someone who didn't just love the poor, but knew how to mobilize people, resources, and energy to turn pain into hope. What's most impressive is that Father Orione never saw these actions as heroism. For him, every disaster was an opportunity to live the gospel in a direct, concrete, and urgent way. As his work grew throughout Italy, Father Orione realized that charity couldn't have borders. His heart, always turned toward the poorest, began to see needs far beyond his own country. That's how an international expansion began, one that would carry his charism across several continents. The first major international mission happened in 1913, when the first Orionian religious arrived in Brazil. And that was only the beginning. In 1921, new missions were sent to Argentina and Uruguay, expanding the work throughout South America. That same year, the mission also reached Palestine, showing that Father Orione's charity could cross oceans and cultures alike. In the following years, the movement continued to spread quickly. In 1923, the Oriones arrived in Poland. In 1925, on the island of Rhodes. In 1934, in the United States. In 1935, in England. And in 1936, in Albania. Every new foundation responded to a real, concrete need: education, care for the poor, shelter for the abandoned. Besides sending missionaries, he insisted on stepping personally onto the lands that welcomed his work. Between 1921 and 1922, and again from 1934 to 1937, he traveled through Latin America, visiting Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile. On these trips, he encouraged communities, guided missionaries, spoke with authorities, and most importantly, drew close to the poor. His relationship with Brazil was so strong that he often repeated a phrase that eventually became famous: "What I cannot do for Brazil while I'm alive, I will do after I die." Over his lifetime, Father Orione earned something extremely rare: the deep trust of several popes. Leo XIII, Pius X, Benedict XV, Pius XI, and Pius XII not only admired his work, they turned to him in decisive moments. His name became synonymous with balance, prudence, and above all, unwavering fidelity to the Church. It's striking to think that someone who began by helping poor children ended up being consulted on matters of enormous importance. This trust became even clearer when the popes began assigning him delicate missions involving tensions between civil and ecclesial authorities. Father Orione was frequently sent to calm conflicts, reopen dialogue, and build bridges where everyone else saw walls. He had an incredible talent for bringing together people with completely opposite views, always protecting unity and avoiding division. One of the most significant moments of his political and ecclesial involvement was his indirect participation in the Roman question, one of the greatest conflicts between the Italian state and the Holy See. Working alongside Pope Pius XI, Father Orione became a key figure in conversations aimed at reducing tensions. It was also in this context that he came into contact with Benito Mussolini, during a time when negotiations between the Church and the government demanded extreme care. His role was always the same: to promote understanding without ever compromising the principles of the faith. His gift for dialogue impressed not only popes, but also civil leaders. Politicians, statesmen, and intellectuals saw in him a man who spoke with firmness but without arrogance, with truth but without aggression, with authority but without authoritarianism. He understood that charity isn't expressed only through social works, but also through words that build bridges. When people of his time tried to describe Father Orione, they almost always used the same expression: a limitless heart. It was as if his capacity to love never found an end, as if there were always room for one more poor person, one more suffering soul, one more abandoned child. Among his greatest virtues were humility, joy, and an unshakable trust in divine providence. Father Orione believed God guided everything, not so that he could sit back and relax, but so that he would have the courage to dare. Not by accident, some of his most famous phrases eventually became almost a spiritual testament. Only charity will save the world. Always do good, good to everyone, never harm, and harm no one. These weren't slogans, they were life choices, rules of action. Father Orione believed that charity had the power to transform realities, disarm conflicts, heal wounds, and lead people back to God. In the last months of his life, Father Orione faced silent suffering marked by serious heart and respiratory problems. His doctors and the confreres insisted that he be taken to San Remo, hoping the milder climate would help him regain strength. But his heart resisted the idea of leaving the poor. He even said, with the sincerity of someone who had always lived for service, "I don't want to die among palm trees. I want to die among the poor, who are Jesus Christ." Even against his wishes, he was taken to San Remo. But those who lived with him knew that this trip, in some way, was the final chapter. His body was showing clear signs of exhaustion, but his soul remained steady, peaceful, and completely surrendered to Divine Providence. Death came on March 12, 1940, just 3 days after his arrival. In the simple room where he rested, surrounded by his confreres, Father Orione spoke his last words, short but incredibly profound. "Jesus, Jesus, I'm coming." A farewell full of intimacy, confidence, and love. His whole life seemed to come down to those words, like a return to the God he had served tirelessly in every poor person, every orphan, every suffering soul. He was buried at the sanctuary of Our Lady of the Guard in Tortona, a place he himself had helped establish. What no one imagined was what would happen 25 years later. In 1965, during the canonical examination for his cause of sainthood, his body was found incorrupt, preserved in a way the Church considered an extraordinary sign. For many, this confirmed what everyone already sensed. Father Orione had lived so united to God that even his death carried a testimony of grace. Today, his tomb remains a place of prayer, pilgrimage, and comfort. Those who visit feel that the flame of charity he lit is still alive. The story of Father Orione didn't end with his death. In fact, his legacy became even clearer as the years passed, leading the Church to officially recognize his holiness. The process began early, in 1937, when he was still alive, a rare fact that shows the strength of the witness he offered everywhere he went. His beatification took place on October 26, 1980, celebrated by Saint John Paul II, who had a deep admiration for the Orione family. The miracle chosen for beatification was the extraordinary cure of young Giorgio Passamonte in 1944. He was dying from terminal tuberculous meningitis and was on the brink of death when, suddenly, and in a way science could not explain, he fully recovered after prayers were offered through Father Orione's intercession. The second miracle required for canonization happened decades later. In 1990, Pietro Panacca, a 78-year-old man, was diagnosed with malignant lung cancer, with no chance of surgery or treatment. After his family prayed for Father Orione's intercession, Pietro recovered within days, without lasting damage. He went on to live many more years, something completely contrary to the medical prognosis. With these miracles recognized, the canonization of Father Orione took place on May 16, 2004, in St. Peter's Square, again led by St. John Paul II. During the ceremony, the Pope described him as Father of the poor, benefactor of suffering and abandoned humanity, and also a limitless heart, expanded by the charity of Christ. Powerful words, perfectly capturing the spiritual greatness of this man. Which of these descriptions speaks to you the most? Today, more than a century after his mission began, the name of Saint Luigi Orione continues to echo across the world. The work that started with almost no resources, sustained only by trust in Providence, is now present in dozens of countries across 4 continents. It's amazing to see how one single heart, moved purely by charity, managed to reach so many nations. Orione houses have multiplied over time. Schools, social centers, homes for people with disabilities, little catalengos, and sanctuaries continue welcoming those who need help the most. In every one of these institutions, the same spirit of the founder still beats, to serve with joy, to heal deep wounds, and to restore dignity to those whom society often forgets. For everything he lived and taught, Father Orione came to be known as the patron of the abandoned. That title isn't just symbolic. It truly reflects the heart of a man who dedicated every minute of his life to people left on the margins. And his words remain just as powerful today as when he first spoke them. Let's empty our hearts of everything that is not God, that is not love. This line pushes us to reflect on our own priorities. What are we still carrying inside that we could let go of? What keeps us from living a more authentic, transformative charity? Before we close this journey through the extraordinary life of Saint Luigi Orione, it's worth pausing for a moment. Take a deep breath. Let everything we've heard, his burning charity, his love for the poor, his absolute trust in providence, find a place in your heart. Because stories like this aren't meant just to be admired, they're meant to spark real change in our own lives. So before the final prayer, I invite you to a moment of inner silence. What might God be wanting to say to you through the example of this saint? Lord God, source of all charity, we thank you for the radiant witness of Saint Luigi Orione. Teach us to love without limits, to serve without expecting anything in return, and to recognize in every person the face of Christ. Purify our hearts of everything that is not love, so that we may walk generously and faithfully, sustained by your divine providence. Be close to us in our sorrows, strengthen us in our struggles, and inspire us to live with the same courage and tenderness that marked the life of this saint. Saint Luigi Orione, pray for us. Amen. Now, before you go, I want to speak directly to you. Yes, you who stayed with us all the way to the end. If this video touched your heart, inspired you, or simply helped you learn more about this giant of charity, don't forget to leave a like. That really helps more people discover stories like this one. Consider becoming a channel member as well. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful, well-crafted content made with a lot of care. And of course, tell me in the comments, which part of Saint Luigi Orione's life spoke to you the most today? His courage? His trust in God? His total dedication to the poor? I'd love to read your answer. If you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our next stories of faith and inspiration. And before you leave, there's one more gift for you. On the final screen, another special video will pop up, chosen to help you go even deeper in your spiritual journey. Click on it and keep walking with us. Thank you so much for being here, and see you in the next video.